Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for, as Felix and Oliver have said, the fifth and last of our series, Swing Time, Serendipitous Conversations about the Rococo. As everyone knows, The Swing, the painting shown on my screen, is one of the most representative works of the entire French 18th century. And we at the Wallace Collection were so privileged and honored to be able to spend quite a bit of time thinking about it and looking at it closely this past autumn because it was the object of a major conservation campaign. Those of you who are interested in learning more about the conservation project itself can now discover it on film. We've produced a short 20-minute film, which is available for viewing on our website. I think it's quite interesting. It's a lot of fun. It has quite a bit of behind the scenes information. So do check it out when you have a moment. To celebrate the cleaning and restoration of this painting, we have also been thinking quite a bit about its relevance and its continued meaning in today's society. And to help us do this, we've invited 5 art practitioners and artists and 5 thinkers to participate in a series of virtual conversations around key themes arising from this painting: pink, identity, fashion, play, and the Libertine. Joining me tonight to wrap up this series with the Libertine, I'm completely honored and delighted to be joined by costume and set designer and artist Simon Bejer and Chantal Thomas, who is the director emerita of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. So I'd like to introduce them. Simon is an artist and theater designer who's based in London. His work spans drama, opera, film, and exhibitions, and he's worked with venues including the Royal Opera House, Garsington Opera, Amazon Studios, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. He has a special interest in period costume and historical decor, and exploring the many crossovers between the performing and visual arts. And on a personal note, I would like to say that Simon is actually the person who prompted me and my colleague Felix Zorzo, who you heard at the beginning and who's also been very much involved in this series. He really prompted us to name the series Serendipitous Conversations about the Rococo because it was his chance inquiry about the availability, the accessibility of certain of our 18th century French paintings that really got us thinking about the question of relevance, about who was looking at the Wallace's collections, who was engaging with them. We had an utterly delightful conversation with Simon, and it's one that's ended up in this very evening. So thank you for that, Simon, and welcome.
I didn't actually know that it was that serendipitous occurrence that started the conversation. So it's really quite an honor. Thanks.
The honor is mine. Thank you so much for joining us. And our second guest is the remarkable Chantal Thomas, writer, essayist, playwright, and professor. Chantal has taught in the United States. She is the director emerita of France's prestigious Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS, as I said at the beginning. She's a specialist of the 18th century who has published on Casanova, Marie Antoinette, Madame de Staël, and the French Salon and the Art of Conversation. She's best known for her novel Farewell, My Queen, Les Adieux à la Reine, which some of you may have seen on film because it was made into a very successful film by Benoît Jacot. The book was awarded the 2002 Prix Femina. And in addition to historical novels, Chantal also pursues an autobiographical oeuvre. Of Sand and Snow, De Sable et de Neige was published in 2020, and it's her most recent publication. And in January 2021, she was elected to the Académie Française. Welcome, Chantal and Simon. It's such a pleasure to have you both with us. Now, before we launch in, I wanted to say a few words about the theme of this evening, the Libertine. Over the course of this series, we've spent a lot of time talking about the iconography of the painting, We've also had very interesting conversations about the social attitudes towards fashion and play that really inform it on various levels. But we haven't spoken very much about what it was intended to do, about who wanted to own it, and the very interesting and mysterious circumstances of its commission. So before we go any further, I wanted to recount those circumstances. We're told by the 18th century writer Charles Collet that starving artist Jean-Honoré Fragonard was approached by an unnamed gentleman of the court with a commission so scandalous that another painter had already rejected it outright. Collet's account came directly from Gabriel François Doyen, the painter who had passed on the project. And I'm quoting what the commission was. So this is Doyen speaking to Charles Collet. A gentleman of the court sent for me in order to commission a painting. He was at his pleasure house, or petite maison, with his mistress when I presented myself. I should like, he said, to have you paint Madame, pointing to his mistress, on a swing that a bishop would push. You will place me in such a way that I would be able to see the legs of this lovely girl, and better still, if you want to enliven your picture a little more. So as we all know, in the end, Doyen passed on the commission, but he did suggest that Fragonard would be an appropriate artist to take it on. And the result is the painting that now hangs on the walls of the Wallace Collection. This is one of the most specific and unusual commissions on record in the history of European art. So what does it tell us about this gentleman of the court? And more importantly, what does it tell us about the culture of the time, the culture that could produce a commission like this? This is the first slide that we wanted to share with you. And I think that Chantal will maybe tell us a little bit about the society that would kind of support a commission like this. Who was this person and what kind of society was he coming from?
Bon, il est important de noter que le commissionnaire,
It is important to notice
celui qui fait cette demande, est un courtisan. Il appartient à la cour.
that it is a gentleman from the court who
Et
commissioned this painting.
ça veut dire que c'est un homme de loisir.
So
Absolu.
it means that he's a man of pleasure.
Le libertinage, qui à l'origine est une
And
critique philosophique,
The
et
libertine at the origin of this
aussi de toute
philosophy.
loi, et surtout de la loi de Dieu. Donc il y a un athéisme au départ.
He's
et
an atheist to start
le
off with,
libertinage implique une
and it
dédication,
implies
une manière de se dédier entièrement à
a
l'art
way to fully dedicate
sans prendre,
your
sans
life
avoir
to
aucun
pleasure
souci de gagner sa vie.
without being worried about earning
Le libertinage
a
suppose
living.
beaucoup de temps et
The libertine has a lot of time
une imagination qui permet
and a lot of
de
imagination
renouveler
to
les plaisirs et de
to
penser
renew
à chaque fois un nouveau
the
dispositif
pleasure and think about
de
something
l'apparition
positive.
de la femme ou de l'homme désiré.
So games like this, Chantal, were they actually played, do you think, in real life?
Ah, oui, bien sûr, bien sûr. Les petites maisons,
Yes, of course.
il faut imaginer que Paris était en grande partie une campagne.
So Paris was like the countryside, really.
Par exemple, à Pigalle, il y avait la
In
petite
Pigalle,
maison du maréchal de Richelieu. Et
for example, that you had the petite maison
château
of
avec des
Richelieu.
parcs. Et
You also had like boats in
la
Paris,
nature faisait
and
partie
nature
de ces
was very
jeux
much part
libertins,
of the
c'est-à-dire
city
que
and was very much part of these games.
ce qui les sépare d'un rapport
Okay.
sérieux au corps de la
So
femme,
this was really
à
a
l'émotion,
different way
il faut
also to
absolument
approach
que ce
the
soit un jeu.
body of women.
Tous ces jeux,
So all these games
l'idée de la mettre sur une balançoire, c'est
and
aussi
this
que
idea to have her on the swing,
c'est une manière, évidemment,
It
c'est
is
une antenne voyeuriste, mais ça veut
playful,
dire aussi que
it's
elle
voyeurism,
est inaccessible. Il y a, dans le
but
libertinage,
also
il n'y a pas de désir de prise. Et je
there
crois que
is
c'est très important.
also
C'est
this
le
kind of
contraire de l'amour et de
imagination.
l'amour-passion.
So it's the opposite of a passionate
Passion,
love,
dans l'instant où on
because that's what the libertine is,
et c'est ça que je trouve
and
fascinant.
that's what I find fascinating.
It is fascinating. So it's really a society that's dominated by these games that are played on all levels of society, both indoors and outdoors. We saw outdoors, but then they could equally be played and represented with cards. We also have that here with a sort of social card game.
Oui, parce que
Then, I'm sorry.
je pense que c'est une société qu'on représente surtout
Yes, because I
comme
think it's also a society
et du côté d'une avancée vers la
that
révolution.
you see towards going towards revolution.
C'est une société d'aventuriers.
So it is a society of adventurers too.
Ça se voit beaucoup dans le film génial de Stanley Kubrick.
And that's what you see in the movie as well of Stanley Kubrick.
Et ce jeu risque de déséquilibrer la société, puisque
So
les forces
it's
ne sont
really
plus méritées ni
these
méritées, mais
games.
relèvent des jeux de hasard.
And those games are really a significant part in society.
This is also quite interesting in that clearly in a film made so many years later, it also shows what we retain from this society. It's the strongest image that it has left us. The idea of these group kind of frolics. And of course, it is a image that is immortalized by Fragonard, not just in The Swing, but in the 4 magnificent works that he made for Madame du Barry, just, I guess it must have been about 4 or 5 years after The Swing. These 4 canvases that are now in New York City. How do you read these canvases, Chantal?
D'abord, à chaque fois que j'arrive à New York, je vais les voir.
Every time I come to New York, I go and see them.
Quelque chose m'enthousiasme.
So there's something fascinating about them.
D'abord, c'est l'air qui passe. Il y a une légèreté.
The lightness, really, it's light, it's fresh.
Et les corps, aussi bien des hommes que des femmes,
And you see the body of
des
men,
corps de danseurs.
women, and they are like dancers.
Ils marchent ou ils dansent.
They walk,
Il y a
they dance.
un effet d'apesanteur. Tout va vers le haut.
But it's like everything is going
le ciel
up towards the
était l'élément majeur. Ou l'eau.
here towards the sky. Everything is going upwards.
Et ce qui est très beau, c'est qu'on le voit dans le tableau du couronnement.
And that's really beautiful.
Ces scènes sont représentées.
How those scenes are represented.
Mais à l'intérieur même
But also inside the
un jeune
painting,
homme est en train de les dessiner. Et ça,
you
c'est
see
quelque
these
chose
young
de
men
libertinage. C'est ce
here
sens
on the bottom
de-
right
le
painting them.
libertinage est spontané puisqu'il s'agit de
So
dessiner.
It is really something spontaneous
Il est
on the
aussi
one hand,
dans le dédoublement, la
but
réflexion,
also
jeu de miroir.
in reflection with a mirror game here.
Donc les corps sont des corps de danseurs, mais
So
aussi
you have
des
these
statues.
bodies of dancers,
Et de même les arbres. Les arbres sont,
and look at the trees as well.
ils peuvent être aussi des nuages, ils sont pris dans cette
They are like clouds too. So it's a mix between both.
dans une sorte de sensualité
So it's
rapide,
very sensual
parce que le libertinage est du côté du mouvement.
because a libertine is also something that it goes with a movement.
Et c'est pourquoi l'amour est le
And that's
contraire
why
du libertinage.
a
puisque
love is the opposite of being a libertine.
I find that absolutely fascinating, this idea that love means to stop moving. I think that's a really wonderful idea and quite powerful given all that we've said about the motion going on in the swing as well, with this sort of backwards and forwards pendulum movement. Now, I remember that you had some very interesting thoughts about the love letter, the painting that's shown on the right of the slide. And your reading of that, I think, was just, I thought, remarkable.
Quand j'ai regardé ce tableau, j'ai pensé immédiatement aux liaisons dangereuses.
When I looked at this painting, I thought of Les Liaisons
Madame
Dangereuses
de
straight
Merteuil,
away, Mrs. de Merteuil,
qui
Madame de
pose pas
Merteuil,
toutes les lettres. Elle sait tout ce qui se passe, elle est
who
comme le
knows
metteur en scène,
everything that's happening.
Et dans la lettre d'amour,
And in the love letter,
j'ai immédiatement pensé que
I
elle le
thought
faisait
immediately
confident d'une lettre qu'elle avait reçue de quelqu'un.
that she read to
Justement pour que le
her
monde ne s'arrête pas.
confidant what she had a letter that she
En fait,
received.
C'est la duplicité même, ou la
It's
triplicité.
with a lot of duplicity.
I think that's a very powerful idea. I'm sure it surprises many of our listeners because it completely cuts against the sort of sweetness that I imagine many others have tended to read into these paintings. But, you know, it makes perfect sense given what we see in The Swing and also what we know about Fragonard and this society. The other thing that I find very interesting about these paintings, and I think this really comes out in the meeting, is the idea of the performative, the very theatrical nature of the Rococo and the sort of Libertine aesthetic, which I know was very striking to Simon on seeing this when we looked at this image together.
Yeah, Chantal, thank you for including these because they're amongst my favorite works of art and it's so sort of central to, I think, our view of the period. But I'm just fascinated by the theatricality of this series of paintings. I mean, on face value, the scale of the figures is so much like that of a theater. Where else in art of the period can you think of would so much of the painting be taken up by the scenery that is echoing the mood and the feelings of the protagonists, of the actors? And if you look at the meeting, just in quite another face value, the man on the right is coming in from the side of the stage almost, you know, he's coming into center stage to be part of the action. And speaking as a designer, if I were creating this mise en scène, if you want to attract attention to someone on stage, what do? Put them in red, especially on a green background. So, I mean, the devices Fragonard is using are so intensely theatrical, and I'm sure we'll speak about that further as we go along.
And then the idea of verticality that Chantal touched on, I think also really does resonate in The Swing. And so we've included an image of it just to really make that point. Because of course, one of the things that came out during cleaning, you know, always there, but never really noticed. And then once this 100-year-old varnish was removed, it kind of, you know, just seems so inevitable that it was there, is this beautiful shape that seems to really recall that of a fountain, a sort of jet d'eau, the kind of water theater that Fragonard would have seen when he was at the Villa d'Este, where he spent a summer drawing. And again, there's that, you know, sense of the kind of movement and verticality and the sort of way in which this water is sort of striving towards the sky that I think really touches on what you said, Chantal, and of course is a harbinger of what Fragonard would work out 5 years later with the Frick series.
Ce que Fragonard a.
So the games that we were looking at the beginning, and the you know, with the seesaw and blind man's buff, and then of course the swing, these are all kind of physical enactments of what I think we're saying is a sort of philosophy of life. There's games that then are played in more kind of intellectual ways, houses of cards, and then in even more sort of intellectual, if that's the right word, ways with other people's lives, with, you know, works like the Liaisons Dangereuses. And that seems to really translate into a philosophy of life that maybe Fragonard comes back to later in his career with a work like this, The Stolen Kiss from 1787. Simon, what are your thoughts on this painting?
Well, immediately when seeing this painting, as when Chantal showed it to me, I could only think of one thing, and that's the Mozart opera, The Marriage of Figaro. It looks just as if it's a still from the stage. In that opera, there are always people hiding in wardrobes, popping out, hiding behind chairs, cross-dressing. There's this really libertine spirit in the opera. And interestingly, that opera dates from 1786. So it got us wondering if there was a connection. Probably it's unlikely that Fragonard at this point had seen the opera since it was premiered in Vienna, but it really sums up the zeitgeist, I guess, of the fact that these great artists at the same time had the same feelings about society.
There's certainly grounds to think that they had some kind of connection because they were both in Paris in 1778, and it has been suggested that they met during that year in a salon, as it happens. So potentially around one of these social games.
I think that. Go ahead.
Je pense absolument en continuité avec ce que
I agree with you about the meeting between Mozart and Fragonard. It's also
c'est-à-dire qu'il y a dans
tone.
Mozart quelque chose
in
de
Mozart,
du libertinage.
there is something that which is the spirit, the very spirit of libertinage. It's a way of brushing against drama. It's like a caress. And in this picture, you see also just a rubbing, it's like rubbing.
Et je pense que dans Mozart, il y a
I think that in Mozart,
voilà.
there is the same atmosphere, the same sense.
Ça rejoint
and also, going back to what you said, Simon, there is a movement in the curtain in this picture, like the curtain on the scene, and it's velvety as well, just like a theater curtain.
And then just again, to really make the point, this is potentially the kind of scene in which Mozart and Fragonard could have met, this salon in which people gathered to practice the arts together in a social context.
Wouldn't you love to have been in that room?
Yes.
I'm sure they were drinking something wonderful too.
Mais on oublie, justement, c'est quelque chose sur cette société qu'on oublie et qu'on a du mal à se représenter.
There are things that we forget about this society and we struggle to think of and to picture. I.e., how much readers and writers were close. They knew each other. And also,
faisait partie du comportement. J'ai lu des choses extraordinaires sur des lettres de condamnés aristocrates et ils se rejouaient entre eux la scène de leur condamnation.
Where people had been condemned to death and they would play a reenact the scene where they were condemned to death. The interpreter is not sure about this translation because the sound is very bad.
Just to wrap up our sort of contextual section. So I'm showing here what I think many believe to be Fragonard's most kind of overtly libertine painting. It's a work called Le Verrou. It lives in the Musée du Louvre in Paris. Simon and Chantal, what for you do you see when you look at this work?
D'abord, ce que j'ai dit tout à l'heure à Simon, la présence du rideau est incroyable. La présence du rideau n'est presque
to Simon, the curtain is incredible. It's present, it's there.
Et ce que je sens
and what I
là,
feel,
c'est pas du tout le cas pour une série du Wallace Collection.
art
Quelque
is
chose au
not for
bord
the
de
same.
l'angoisse.
for the Frick collection, because this is very close to
c'est lié, comme le théâtre
anxiety.
tragique, à la clôture du lieu.
The room is
Fragonard
closed.
sont du côté de la source, du feuillage.
Usually with Fragonard, you are next to a spring with boughs of trees and
justement du côté du
a
verrou,
rainbow. But
se refermer sur vous
in
comme,
this
comme un piège.
painting, you have a lock that can be
C'est
closed on you, just like a snare.
Tenté,
It's great because the woman is both tempted and terrorized.
c'est au bord du viol. Disons.
So this is very on the verge of rape, really.
And Simon.
Well, I mean, every time I look at it, I see something else. But what I think is so extraordinary about Fragonard that perhaps many people don't think about is how psychological he is as a painter. And even in the examples that we've seen up till now, always he gets the setting to reinforce the emotions and reinforce the story. And really, here he's done this. It's quite, again, theatrical. He's pushed the action right up against the picture plane, this flat, almost a theater flat, a wall against you. Yeah. And this giant red curtain, which is taking up half the picture. And these, you know, it's anxious, as Chantal says, it's heightened. And then this incredibly theatrical lighting coming in from the right, highlighting that tortured kind of, those hands, he's reaching for the lock and she's trying to stop him. That it's a tiny gesture, but you see it because he's focused all his kind of lighting designer's attention on that little motif, and it's very powerful and disturbing. I think probably more so for a modern viewer.
It is a disturbing painting, and one that, as you say, lends itself to so many different readings, which I think is quite. It is. I think that it goes with what you're saying, Simon, about this sort of psychological nature of Fragonard, that he, more than many artists of his period, makes us question things, and the fact that we are invited to read our own narrative or interpretation onto these works is quite modern, and really not what artists were supposed to do at the time period, which is kind of serve up a moral in a sort of neat little bow.
Perhaps it's disarming the power of the painting somewhat to wonder, maybe is this a performance, or perhaps even a performance, a role play for themselves? Perhaps really this isn't a dangerous situation. It's two lovers who are having a bit of kinky fun. I don't know. You know, it's a thought.
Et je pense que pour effacer ou non, amoindrir le tragique,
to erase the tragical part of things, the movement in the curtain and in the dress.
Tout du côté de la femme et dans le mouvement. L'homme est de dos.
All this movement is on the side of the woman.
Et la symétrie
the man
est très très rare. C'est très très rare la symétrie dans Fragonard.
Is seen from the back, and there is a very seldom some symmetry of the genders.
C'est quelque chose aussi autour du désir qui.
And this is also something about desire.
C'est un génie, un peintre génial du désir.
He was a genius painter.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Agreed. So here we have some examples of Simon's work, and Simon, you've opted to include an image of the lock as well.
Yeah, yes, I have. I think because it takes me into the same psychological space of what, as a set designer, I'm trying to achieve on stage. This is a production of a Handel opera called Rodelinda, which was written in the 1720s, I think, and it takes place in a royal court. It's about murder and betrayal and intrigue, and literally people stabbing each other in the back. And it made me really think of the lock.
Et en fait, ça va vraiment fait penser.
To isolate these characters in a quite a psychological space by removing everything extraneous and just putting them in a kind of blood-soaked palace, which is really a psychological space. It's not meant to be seen literally at all. And this red curtain was present and moved throughout the opera. So yeah, I thought it was just a great way.
And remarkable. Now, here we have an image of an actual 18th century theater. Does this sort of type of, this relationship constructed in the 18th century between the audience and the stage, is that something that you think about in your own work as you design sets?
Yes, definitely, and it's something particularly these 18th and even 17th century conventions of that receding space and those concentric, progressively smaller flats that take you into the distance. It's definitely something I refer to a lot. And just a note on this: this is really a miraculous survival. It's a timber theatre built in the 18th century, and not only is the fabric of the building completely original, everything you see there, but they still have a complete set of theatre of set designs that were made in the 1760s by Johannes Vetschel and Leo Martel. So we can really see how things really were in that time, and the sophistication is quite remarkable. But I also, Yuriko, to come back to the sense of this kind of blurring of lines, because if you look at the ceiling here, it's a trompe-l'oeil sky, and the curtain that is around the proscenium is also painted. So there's this real play of artifice and reality and theatricality that's going on, which I find totally delightful.
I find the layering effect remarkable, and as we'll see, because in a little bit we're going to have an image of the swing juxtaposed against one such theater. I think that you really start to understand the kind of pictorial values that Fragonard was working with, and I think it's very convincing. So here's another one of your pieces, which I find remarkable.
Yeah, I think it comes in a good place directly after that, because you can see how the echoes here are of the theatre in Český Krumlov. This is another Handel opera, which is something for some reason I do a lot of. The setting is ancient Greece. It's Ariadne in Crete. But the director and I wanted to refer also to the Baroque setting, the Baroque origins of the opera itself. So we came up with this design, which was really pared back, and we had these concentric borders, but they were left unpainted or we treated them, but the idea was to expose the mechanics of it, and these clouds and all of our set elements like that were very explicitly exposed with gold ropes, which is really quite fun. The clouds themselves were photographs which we had printed at that scale. So I love to layer these kind of references. You've got the contemporary with the photography, then the Baroque conventions of things coming from the top and sides, and then the ancient Greek theatre, which is evoked not only by the simple staging, but the costumes as well. And I think there's another slide of those.
Yeah. Je pensais que l'esprit baroque est contre l'esprit de sérieux. C'est complètement
it's true that the baroque is opposite to being too serious.
L'esprit de sérieux contre l'esprit de sérieux.
So it's really against this spirit here.
Perhaps that's why it appeals to some of us so much, I think. Fragonard, he must have had a wonderful sense of humor.
Sure.
So in this is a couple of costumes from that production that I just showed you. And we did this layering of period theme where we took images, photos of ancient Roman and Greek sculptures and printed them onto the costumes. So there was like a triple layering effect, and it's symbolic as well. And theatre always uses symbols to powerful effect. So that I thought was worth putting in.
C'est aussi l'image de l'amour avec ses petites ailes.
So it's an image of love with the beautiful wings.
Yeah, well, that indeed, that figure on the side, that was Cupid. So Cupid not portrayed as he might be in a classical theatre, but he's in a modern suit. But evoked the his celestial nature is evoked by the sky on his suit, and he had gold Converse high tops, which I thought was very cool.
I was gonna say I'm a real fan of his footwear.
Yeah, we gilded them with real gold leaf.
Wow. Here's another costume that I think I recognize.
Yeah, this is an opera, much more contemporary opera by Jonathan Dove, an English composer. But again, the source is an 18th century fairy tale. It's by Carlo Gozzi, who wrote for the Commedia dell'arte, which I know we'll get on to. So there are a lot of the stock characters which are in there. But this particular scene, the stage directions called for the garden of a princess. And I thought about it, and I thought with this really simple gesture, we could evoke that. I mean, that's the joy for me of having such a wonderful, such a universally recognized work of art like The Swing that is instantly recognizable to everyone. You put this on stage, there is no need to create a backdrop because it's there in our minds. And I think also modern audiences, if we're not doing film, this is theater, and I think you have to make the audience work a little bit and use their imagination. And I love doing that. I love giving just enough information and then pulling back. So, but of course, even looking here, you can fill in the blanks for yourself.
I'm going to move us slightly quickly so that we have time for questions at the end. So this is the same play, I think.
This is the same play, and
she has her shoe off. That's wonderful.
Yes, they're trying on. She has her servant there trying on shoes. This was like a split screen effect where we had two different scenes going on at the same time, and one was lit in pink and one in blue. But again, it shows how powerful those small props can be because we didn't. The scenes needed to change really quickly in this opera because it changes location very quickly. So we had them come around on a revolve. And they really did the job of evoking the interiors of 18th century Europe.
Tell me that she kicked off her shoe across the room. That would be it.
Oh, well, yeah.
You'll have to add that next time.
Yes, I can Photoshop a shoe in there for me.
It's absolutely wonderful. So here, are you seeing the same slide as I am? The Love for Three Oranges? Okay.
I'll be brief here. So again, this is another 18th century source. So I thought it would be worth putting in here, but seen through the eyes of an early 20th century composer. So this is Prokofiev's The Love for Three Oranges. And he wrote it in 1921, at a time when he was really getting interested in the surrealism that was taking Europe by storm. And the music is wild and chaotic. It's wonderful, but it's zany and erratic. And so I wanted to reflect the music in the stage setting, but also the 18th century origins of the story. So again, you can see on the right, these concentric, these diminishing perspective, but I've twisted it and it's pushed off its axis. And it really created this sort of destabilization and a sort of whirling dizziness, which was really great. The stage was also in a revolve. So if you can imagine these large shapes twisting, it was dizzying, and a lot of the audience reactions were that they loved it, but it made them feel slightly ill. Yeah.
Which is maybe the effect of the best art. So
perhaps.
I don't know if you took it as a compliment, but
another thing here to take note of is the limited color palette, which I think so many artists, we'll see Boucher in a moment, and then Fragonard, are always really controlling the color palette. And perhaps that is something that feeds into theater and art, back and forth.
And then, of course, I am enjoying your Commedia dell'arte references here, which are quite 18th century. And I think also very, it's bringing the theater in on another level, because the Commedia dell'arte is 18th century theater. Absolutely.
I'm so glad you brought Watteau into it. I think it's pretty clear he was obsessed with the theater, wasn't he? But I think he was just the beginning of this zeitgeist. I think because he came so early in the century, he hit on something, and really it was everyone was obsessed with the theater, in particularly the Italian theater in the 18th century. I guess they didn't have film or Netflix or whatever, so what they saw last night at the opera or the Comédie Française was what they would talk about. I don't know.
C'est intéressant qu'un des plus grands représentants du libertinage et de la séduction soit Casanova.
Interesting that one of the biggest representatives of the libertine, Casanova,
qui était l'actrice préférée de Goldoni.
Basically,
son art de vivre,
here, this art of living,
tout droit de la Commedia dell'arte,
comes directly from
de cette ville, Venise, qui était un théâtre.
Venice, which was a theater.
Et c'est cette idée aussi de la vie comme un carnaval.
And it's this idea of life
je voulais dire,
like a carnival.
Mais j'y tiens, c'est que quelque chose lié au libertinage,
and I think something
je comprends qu'il y ait une réaction morale de
libertine.
Quelque chose que je trouve bien et vraiment positif, c'est l'absence de culpabilité.
Here, that is the lack of guilt.
Instant après instant,
there's no guilt.
Un jeu d'improvisation.
It is an improvisation game.
L'idée, et justement c'est dans Fragonard, c'est qu'on va vers quelque chose vers quelque chose de léger, vers quelque chose côté de l'évaporation.
We're going to something like very light here, and that's this idea.
Et les mises en scène qu'on a vues de Simon, à mon avis, sont dans ce sens.
What you can see here on stage and what you've represented, Simon, is very much in that same spirit.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to look at these, and also the Watteau from the previous slide. There is this blurring of boundaries. We, in the Watteau, we see actors, or at least people dressed in costume, but are they on stage? Is it a real garden, or is it a stage set? Or are they on the wings of somewhere, an outdoor, performance space? And if you go to the next slides, Yuriko,
it's marvelous.
These are doing the same thing. Lancret here is blending real personas with performance personas. These are two portraits which could almost here be seen as pendants, but I don't think they are. I don't think they go together. We see on the left Camargo, and on the right Marie Salé, and they were, if I'm not mistaken, the most famous ballet dancers of their day, both of them. And Lancret actually, I think he made, these were turned into prints, and he became quite a wealthy man selling these, because I guess people wanted to have a piece of the theater, much like a celebrity magazine or a poster. People would want to take home an image of the prima donna.
Just to jump in with 2 quick points. Simon, you're absolutely right that I think the story goes that he made Mademoiselle de Camargo first, and then he thought it would be a very, sort of interesting idea to paint as a pendant, but, sort of later, the other famous ballerina, of the period, who was, of course, Camargo's great rival. And I think she wasn't very happy about it, but he still went ahead. And so the prints were definitely produced as sort of a pair. And it's almost like, playing cards or baseball cards, of the time period where they become these collectible images. And I feel that really kind of shows the interesting, there's a real crossover here between real life and the theater, because these women were such celebrities, but they're also the women who, one could imagine peopling Fragonard's paintings and, sort of going to parties in these petites maisons. These are the kind of women who had these, lives imagined around them by the public because they're so beautiful and they're so famous and they must be doing, sort of naughty things with these very wealthy men.
Entirely. I think Lancret does a lot to create that mythology, literally mythology. His Saleh is almost depicted as a goddess with this Greek temple in the background. So it's all this layering of symbology and symbols and references.
Chantal, what for you is the relationship between celebrity and the libertine kind of aesthetic and moment?
D'abord, je voudrais juste dire à quel point,
first of all,
dans ce siècle,
I would like to say that in that century,
différences de statut des femmes étaient
the differences of statuses of women were huge.
Étaient célèbres.
These ballerinas were.
L'envers de ça, c'est que comme elles étaient communiées, comme tous les genres de théâtre, c'est-à-dire qu'elles étaient mises au banc de la société et de la religion.
And they were pushed aside by the church, just like all theater people.
Donc, elles étaient à la fois méprisées et adorées.
So they were both adulated and despised.
Et il y avait donc ces femmes qui étaient libres.
These women were.
Et qui pouvaient vivre la vie qu'elles voulaient.
Were free. They could have the life they wanted to, as long as they were famous.
C'était à la fois éclatant, et ça, bateau et Renard le montre très bien.
There was something bursting
à la fois éclatant, glorieux,
shows it, glorious,
et en même temps, d'une seconde à l'autre, il suffisait d'une maladie,
one second to the next,
et c'était
because of a disease or because the man who gave them money, protected them, died or decided to drop them, and it was over.
Mais ce que vous avez demandé, Yuriko, est très intéressant.
What you asked, Yuriko, is very interesting because these women were famous.
Libertines et célèbres.
They were libertines.
Tradition artistique et surtout écrite. Il n'y a pas de femmes libertines puisque les femmes ne prenaient pas la plume pour écrire. Déjà, afficher son nom.
Traditionally, the women didn't write publicly.
On n'a pas de témoignage de l'intérieur.
So we have no testimony from the inside of what libertine women actually experienced.
And then, of course, I think that creates this sort of very dangerous, sort of almost like a seesaw existence, that I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on how that carried over for someone who was known to be a mistress, who of course is Madame de Pompadour. She's sort of, all eyes are on her, but she also is quite dependent on this very wealthy man. And how did she live that?
Comment Madame de Pompadour vivait son état de favorite?
Are you saying how did Madame de Pompadour experience her state as a favorite?
Well, à la résidence du royaume, elle vivait exactement comme une danseuse avec son protecteur.
Just like a dancer with a protector.
Okay.
Exactly the same.
Le grand registre de Madame de Pompadour, c'était qu'elle était aussi danseuse. On va le voir.
Madame de Pompadour was also
très bien la comédie.
a ballerina. She could also sing very well, and she was a good actress as well.
Il y a eu un
right from the
rapport
beginning
de
between
sensibilité et
Louis
d'intelligence
XV
beaucoup
and
plus
her,
dominant
there
que
was a lot of
chez les femmes.
complicity
Et je pense
connected
que ça
to
explique qu'elles sont restées
intelligence and the intellect,
favorites tout au long de sa vie.
which explains why she was a favorite all
Pour le
along
verre à
her
plus clair, il
life.
faut vraiment souligner
We have to
l'incroyable gap,
highlight
l'incroyable écart entre
the
Madame de Pompadour
incredible
et
gap
Madame
between
du Barry.
Madame de Pompadour and
Sur
Madame
l'emprise
du
du
Barry,
libertinage sur quelques endroits.
because the hold of libertinage on them was completely different.
I think that it's so interesting that Madame de Pompadour was known for playing, you know, this is a representation of her literally play acting. She's on the stage and the king is watching her on the right of the picture. And she's acting in front of the French court. And, you know, so it really is this kind of role of the ballerina, the danseuse, the actress, but it's kind of being enacted at this higher level and where the stakes are much higher. I find that quite interesting that she, rather than kind of going into the, you know, she knew that she was tremendously powerful, but rather than kind of being very proper, she really kind of embraced this role of the dancer, even though that was such a complicated role.
Oui, c'est quelque chose qui la lie profondément à Louis
Yes,
XV. Elle a
it's
compris
something that connected her very deeply to Louis the
son rôle
15th.
à elle,
He was very melancholy,
entre Versailles et
and
Paris,
his
entre
role
Versailles
was
et les
to
intellectuels et les philosophes,
make a
et de
link
maintenir le
between
roi
Versailles and
hors
Paris
du
and
vertige et
between
de
the
la
artists and
noirceur
the
qui est une
philosophers,
mélancolie.
and keep the
Il
king
y a quelque chose
away from
de
darkness and
Shakespeare dans
melancholy.
l'histoire de Madame de Pompadour qui est
That was
fascinant.
her role is quite fascinating. She was a very intelligent woman.
So Chantal, almost her would you say her role was or her ability to entertain the king, which it was what kept her where she was. There, just going back to the previous slide, I'll just say something. This theatre was this is the only known image of the theatre that was built in Versailles for Madame de Pompadour to perform on herself. The belief is that she actually commissioned Francois Boucher to design the theatre for her. But I think in the spirit of the Libertine, there is a wonderful story where she didn't only perform female roles. She once performed as Prince Charming in trousers, and the king, after the performance, came up on stage and kissed her and said, the most delicious woman in Paris, or the most delicious woman in France. So there is this wonderful libertine spirit in the role play there.
Il est intéressant aussi de noter que Louis XIV et Louis XV
also to note
étaient des rois libertins. Louis XIV,
but that Louis XIV and XV were both libertine kings.
Et que cette tradition libertine va s'arrêter avec le coup Louis XVI et Marie-Antoinette,
Libertine tradition
des rapports
will stop with Marie-Antoinette and Louis XVI, who were in conflict very often, even regarding the education and the upbringing of their children.
So I think it is very interesting to turn to Marie Antoinette, having spoken about Madame de Pompadour, who seems to have blended play acting so seamlessly into her persona, whereas, as we know, Marie Antoinette tried to blend play acting literally with this, you know, house at the Petit Trianon and playing milkmaid and so forth, and it didn't go quite so well for her. And I'm sort of curious to hear Chantal's thoughts on why that is.
D'abord, la situation est très différente.
Well, the situation was very different.
Louis XV
Louis XV
est un roi qui n'a pas à intervenir beaucoup et qui laisse courir les choses, puisque la guerre de 7 ans, c'est
just let things happen,
et
like
il a choisi
the 7-Year
Madame de
War,
Pompadour,
and he chose the
Alors que le lien Louis XVI, Marie-Antoinette, c'est un mariage imposé.
Political person in a way, and they loved each other. Whereas Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were forced to get married.
Déjà, elle arrive à 15 ans. When Marie pas du tout de sens stratégie.
Antoinette came to France, she was only 15. She had no sense of strategy, and she was married to a king who didn't want to be a king.
Et l'art, pour Marie-Antoinette, ça va être simplement l'art de la société, rien d'autre.
Antoinette, the art was just the art of society.
Avec l'exception de Gluck, qui l'a formé au Canada.
Apart from Gluck, because he trained her and she really adored him.
Et elle était mauvaise actrice.
And she was a bad actress.
La catastrophe est née avec ça.
Maybe that's why the disaster occurred.
So I think just to say to everyone, if everyone is happy to go until 8:10, it'll give us the opportunity to wrap up our slides, which I think are really wonderful, and take questions. And I'm suggesting that because it took us a little longer to get started with the translators. So do bear with us. We're on to the final theme of the evening, which is the sort of aesthetic of the theater itself. And we are back to images by Simon, which again, I feel like maybe I'm recognizing some Fragonard here integrated into the patterns on these costumes. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. No. And that's precisely why I put them in here.
It's wonderful. Sadly, I love them.
Sadly, these were never their costume designs that were never realized because of COVID. But they were for an opera called Il Pastor Fido, or The Faithful Shepherd. And what I was attempting to do here was, be playful with the modes of representation and give a sense of setting rather than using the set design, or actually we were planning on a white set. Still, there were details, but it was all white. And that the set changes would be done by the costumes themselves. It's something I think that the 18th century costumes give themselves to, because, well, in a technical way, they've got so much surface. So, you know, Marie Antoinette's skirt is a perfect place to put something wonderful, because no other period has so much volume to play with. And so here I've taken images directly from Fragonard's paintings. You might recognize the background of The Swing here, and there are others. Again, I think in opera, so often there's an expectation, or people say it's not authentic, or it's not accurate to the period. But I think that theater is a living art form, and it's not a wax museum. So there is no reason for things to be as they were. I think the audience responds to a little playfulness, and as I mentioned before, getting their imagination to work a little bit.
I think I'm very glad that you brought in the idea of not just the set design, but the costume design, and thinking about the aesthetic of the clothing worn on the theater, because I think that the link there's another link there with Marie Antoinette that's quite interesting, because Chantal, you had mentioned, and I was so interested to learn this, that Libertine, who was Marie Antoinette's, go-to dressmaker and fashion designer of choice, also designed for the theater. And in choosing to work with this woman, Marie Antoinette was basically putting herself on the level of a dancer, or a woman of the theater, which obviously, if that was allowed for Madame de Pompadour, that certainly wouldn't be allowed for the Queen of France. And I think there's a really interesting kind of understanding, or maybe misunderstanding, of the kind of social norms. And it helps us to see a little better why Marie Antoinette, I mean, how many mistakes she was making, and even mistakes that I think we as Anglo-Saxon scholars wouldn't necessarily understand, but then, you know, to hear from you, I think it sort of opens up a whole new level of nuance.
Oui, c'est à la fois des erreurs, mais à la fois
there were mistakes.
Ce que dit Simon est vrai.
But what Simon said is true. It's true. She wanted to live. She didn't want to be in a museum.
Et son talent, je dis qu'il n'était pas doué comme chanteuse.
I said that she was not a very good singer.
Elle était tellement douée comme costumière et comme styliste.
She was very good as a clothes designer and as a costume designer.
Elle avait
very talented.
Elle avait le génie, le talent, disons, du costume, de la légèreté.
She had talent and genius for costume, for lightness.
Et on a beaucoup reproché ses diamants, mais on oublie la période où
she was reproached with wearing diamonds, but people have forgotten a time when she would wear very, very simple dresses.
Je pense que c'était des erreurs
I
par
think
rapport à la cour, mais
she made mistakes
à erreur. Mais en fait, ça n'avait aucune importance en réalité.
in court.
Elle était l'épouse de Louis XVI, elle n'était pas la
really,
reine.
it didn't.
Elle a servi de bouc émissaire.
It didn't matter because she was Louis XVI's wife. She was not the queen, and she paid.
Voilà.
She paid a high price for that.
Voilà, je pense que vraiment l'univers de Marie-Antoinette,
I think that the universe of Marie-Antoinette
de Louis XV, c'était des univers en quête de bien-être et de bonheur.
Of Louis XV were universe where people were searched for happiness, for well-being.
À une mesure humaine.
And in Versailles, they tried to reduce everything to a human measure. Well, that's what Marie-Antoinette tried to do with her Trianon.
Au lieu du marbre, du papier mâché.
And instead of marble, the theater contained a lot of papier mâché.
Et au lieu d'espaces immenses, de toucher.
Instead of huge places.
Des roseraies, quelque chose justement qui est de tirer la vie de cette espèce théâtrale et
were included. And the idea was to draw out life from these pictures, from these representations.
Et ce théâtre.
I think there's a link between Fragonard and this theater we can see on the side.
I think there's an astounding link, and I have a note here from Simon which says the swing could take place here, meaning in the theater, which I think is spot on.
This is actually the theater that was built as a gift to Marie Antoinette for her to perform in herself. And although the swing does date from a little earlier, I mean, it's remarkable. You could just superimpose it. And the way that Fragonard has constructed the image with the detailed foreground, the sort of actors or the characters in the middle ground, and then this receding background, which in 18th century theatrical convention is always lighter. So the light always comes from the back. And you'll see it again and again in representations of the theater. But it's also a device that Fragonard uses almost constantly.
And that you use as well, Simon, because this is a work of your creation.
Yeah, this was actually a commission. I worked with the V&A to create this. This was for an exhibition they staged on opera called Passion, Power, Politics. And the idea was they have this, there's the opera Rinaldo, which is one of Handel's most celebrated operas. It was premiered in London in 1711. And there is a lot of contemporary accounts that describe how extraordinary the stage effects were, and that no expense was spared on the theatrical mechanics, the special effects. So they wanted to recreate that. And so I did my research, and this was what we came up with. It's slightly earlier than the Rococo things that we've been talking about. So there is a little more classicism, and it's a little more regular, but you can see the same devices being used. And this was actually a working theatre, and those waves you can see at the bottom were a period invention, these corkscrew rolls that would be turned by stagehands and on pulleys, and it created the effect of a rolling sea. And you can probably see for those who are interested, on YouTube, there is a video of this in action. You can just type in V&A model theatre. But it's very, very cool. And then, unfortunately, I don't have an image, but the clouds you can see at the back parted away to reveal a distant vista, a view of an island. So, yeah.
I love it. It's gorgeous.
Interestingly, the people who built the theatres, particularly in this country in the 18th century, were nautical specialists. So they were the people trained as riggers in the shipbuilding industry, and brought their expertise to the theatre. So it was all built in wood, and all of those constructions, the pulleys, the ropes, the winches, the special effects, are things that they could create because of their expertise in shipbuilding. So it's just an interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop our images here. Maybe I think it's an appropriate place to stop and open to questions. And there are a couple, and I think we have just about a minute or two. The first question is for Simon. Simon, I admire your keen sense of vision and theater. Would you please tell me when you're envisaging your would you please tell me where you're envisaging your stage? Is it from art or music that you create your work, or is it a vision of creativity that you have an idea of? Thank you.
That's a really lovely question. I think there's no clear answer to that. I think particularly because I work a lot with opera and ballet as well, music is so central, and I always listen to the music before I even read the text. To get, I think the spirit of the music is so important to be able to capture in vision and in the visual aspect. But I think it's also important to be in harmony with that, and rather than jarring with it. So you have to kind of become friends with the composer in your own mind, and try and think what they would expect. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't do things that are a little bit daring or a little bit unusual, but that's
very good. Yeah, that's a good question and a good
one.
answer.
Well, there was another part of the question which and painting. I was trained initially as a painter, so I always think about it as a painting, and that's why the people I work with, I'm kind of notorious for controlling my colors like crazy, and so because I think each moment on stage should be as beautiful as a painting, like a filmmaker or a director of photography often does. You know, you're creating pictures on the stage, and the people who inhabit that, the characters and their costumes, should fit seamlessly into that world.
That's well, we're all so excited to see what you do next, Simon.
Yes.
I have one quick question for Chantal, which is actually, I think, very interesting. The element of celebrity that we talked about, was that for the wealthy, or was it more for the masses? This idea, for whom was the idea of celebrity the most kind of relevant, or, you know, who did it speak to?
Oui, c'est une question très intéressante sur cette société.
It is a very interesting question on that society.
Il faut encore une fois insister sur l'idée de castes séparées.
Insist on this idea of separated
Il
categories.
y avait la cour, il y avait la célébrité à Paris,
court,
la province.
And you had, first of all, the province.
Le monde était relativement séparé.
And they were very separated.
le peuple obscur des travailleurs.
And of course the worker, which is the obscure part of society.
Uniquement ressenti par une minorité.
And this is why this was only for a minority.
Paris et peut-être Bordeaux,
Paris, and maybe
Lyon.
In other big cities like Bordeaux or Lyon.
Et encore une fois, elle reposait sur des bases très très fragiles puisque il n'y avait pas d'écrivains femmes célèbres.
Of course, very fragile basis because there was very few famous
il y avait simplement des chanteuses
women,
ou des
and there was
danseuses
some singers or dancers
et des comédiennes. C'est-à-dire
and
des femmes dont le talent était indissociable de leur corps.
So it was very difficult to separate women from their body.
Donc c'était une célébrité qui était extrêmement liée à la jeunesse.
So celebrity was also very strongly related to youth.
Et quand Marie-Antoinette devient le sujet de pensée, elle va devenir célèbre
here the topic, she's going to be
de la manière blasphématoire, c'est-à-dire qu'une reine ne doit pas être célèbre en ce sens.
Blasphemous, so that a queen shouldn't act this way.
D'atteinte à la personne royale. Dans la célébrité de Marie-Antoinette, il y a une sorte
here in the celebrity of Marie Antoinette, that's what you can
dans
find.
ces femmes célèbres,
So
il y a
in
une
these women,
atteinte à la dignité des femmes.
there is also something attacking the dignity of women.
Ce qui pour nous est très très inconnu, mais c'est ça qui est beau.
And for us, it's totally unknown, and that's also the beauty in it.
Absolutely. Simon, Chantal, this has been such a pleasure. I think I couldn't have imagined a better way to end this series than talking about this painting with the two of you. I've learned so much. I think it's just been absolutely extraordinary. Thank you both for sharing your expertise and your passion with all of us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you, Yuriko.
And thank you. Thank you, Yuriko.
Thank you all. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.